Hello everyone, welcome to Writing Quest. My name is Brendan Pugh, and in today's episode we're going to talk about how I finished outlining the opening hook. I'm going to walk you through the story beats of that and how I did that with my Notion template and using some techniques from Abby Emmons. Here we go. Huzzah! All right, everyone, so let's first talk about what the opening hook is. Now, I'm going to be doing some more videos talking about the 3-act story structure, but the opening hook essentially is the beginning of the 3-act story structure, which is what I've chosen to use for my books. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm locked into this kind of story structure. It just means it's kind of my starting point. And then I'm going to kind of manipulate it as I go to make it fit. But ultimately, for me, what I've seen with these is that it works best for what I'm trying to accomplish. So let's talk about what the opening hook is. The opening hook has primarily two functions. Main function is to show the main character's internal conflict. Why is this important? Well, we've talked about this a lot before. The internal conflict is the whole reason that you turn the page. It's the reason you like the character. It's the reason that you pretty much are invested in the story. All the external events and all the plot and everything that happens, all of that is fine, but it's never, if you've ever watched or read a book that's plot driven or character driven, the character driven ones always get you more. The Greatest Showman's a great example. It's a movie that I love and a lot of people love. And there's a lot of issues plot-wise, and the reviews for that movie were not really that great. But because you're so invested in the character, it was a wild success and everyone loved it. And it's a really great story because of that internal conflict of the character. So that's the main job of the opening hook. The second thing is to show some external events and some plot, plant some seeds to drive things forward, and ultimately kind of set the stage for the story. Now, in my book, I have a prologue and then I have a chapter 1. So the prologue in my book, does nothing to do with the main character yet. So it's a little bit different. It still has to show the internal conflict of the characters in the scene, but it doesn't set up the internal conflict for the main character of the story. So it's going to show that internal conflict for those characters, but as well as set up some history and set up some backstory, as well as kind of setting the global story in motion. The chapter 1 is the real opening hook, and it's really a sequence. So there's chapter 1, which is in chapter 1, you have to show that internal conflict, so they turn the page. But the opening hook externally, the external plot points of that are kind of multiple chapters. So I've broken mine into 5, potentially 6, but at the moment it's 5 chapters as the opening hook. Now, I kind of look at it as there's 2 opening hooks in a way. There's the short opening hook, which all has to happen in the first chapter. You have to be hooked in the first chapter. Otherwise, you're not going to turn the page. You only have a short amount of time to capture the story for the reader. The following chapters are linked to the opening hook leading to the inciting incident, which we'll talk about in another episode. So they are a part of what I call the opening hook sequence, but they're not the main opening hook, if that makes sense. So let's go to the Notion template and I will show you what I'm talking about. All right, if you've seen my videos before, you know that I like to use Notion to outline a bunch of stuff. And so I have built in here I'm in my chapter outlines section of this, and this will be a template that I'll make available shortly, but I'm continuing to work through the kind of bits and pieces of how it all works. So the top part here, I just have the entire 3-act structure for the book. So I have the hook, the inciting incident build up, all those different things as part of it. This is just so I can see the overview when I need to. So we are only dealing with this opening hook right here, this part. So no more, no less. What I've done here is I kind of wrote the plot of the opening hook and kind of showed here are the kind of the plot points, and then the story is kind of why it matters. That's the internal conflict that we're talking about. So I don't know if I've updated this, but we'll see. So it says, while visiting her father's grave, Ro finds herself standing with Guyan, one of the leaders of the village, who is visiting the grave of his wife. They stand there. As they stand there, they hear a screech somewhere in the forest and something dying. The pair rush off into the forest and find a wolf dead. The dead wolf has electric marks on it. So that's just the events. That's exactly just what happens, okay? Then we go into the story of why it matters. Ro's father died when she was very young. As an upstanding and righteous man, he was a cornerstone of the village, constantly reminded of his good works. She is conflicted between her desire to help and do the right thing and the fear of tarnishing her father's memory. So we're going to set her up as someone who is fully invested in the village. She takes part in everything. She's an upstanding citizen, and she fears not living up to her father's legacy because he was such a great person in this village. That's kind of the main internal conflict. Obviously, there's a lot of twists and turns with that, and it gets a lot deeper, but that's just a kind of a brief overview. We'll scroll down here to the chapter view, and I have prologue, which is kind of part of the opening hook. That's the opening hook for the global story. So, like, I always kind of see this as like, this is the hook for the entire series that we are going to tell, not just this book, although it does have to pertain to this book a little bit. So chapter 1 is the real opening hook where we go. So I have chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I've started adding in which characters are in the scene and which are not. That's mostly just for me to keep track of who is where in the story. But I showed this before, and I'll show you this again. I have the goal of the scene, setup, tension, crossroads, decision, outcome, and the new question. And then eventually we'll get to the scene blocking. Basically, I went through, and the goal of the scene just tells what we're talking about. And so we'll just kind of go through each of those chapters. I won't go through every single part of this, but I'll kind of walk you through the story and why we're doing what we're doing. So in the goal of the scene for chapter 1, Ro and Guyan are together at the graves. They hear a noise and rush into the forest. At the end of the chapter, Ro finds a wolf pup and kneels down to touch it, though Guyan doesn't see. Artemis appears with some villagers. So this is kind of just the plot points of the scene. And the point of chapter 1 is going to be we got to show a couple of things. We got to show that Ro, how she feels about her father. We want to show how she feels in relation to Guyan, which I'm going to kind of position as the replacement father figure, how she reacts with the village, which is obviously based on how she is with her father and how she feels about the village. And then, of course, we got to set up a couple of external things. So she's going to see this wolf pup, and she's going to feel sort of a connection to it, which leads into our next couple parts. So basically, it just kind of goes from there. So chapter 2, we go, the villagers return back to town where Artemis tries to calm the people about the dead wolf. So we're going to have a little town hall meeting, and everyone's going to be kind of outraged and up in arms about what happened in the forest with the wolf. And they're going to be panicking about the wolves. And we're kind of setting up that conflict of wolves and wizards, of the wolves and the wizards, and how they're kind of not really meshing at this point. So that's the next part of the opening hook. We'll go to chapter 3. The town continues preparing for the big festival. So they're having a festival that celebrates their arrival here, however many years ago that was. And Ro finds herself hunting out in the forest. So a couple of days maybe go by, they're preparing for the festival. They kind of forget about the events in the forest, but now she's got to go out into the forest, okay? While she's out in the forest in chapter 4, she's going to find the wolf pup again and spends a brief amount of time with it when she is confronted by a grown wolf. When the wolf attacks, Ro struggles to fight it. Joram, which is one of her friends in the story, is going to step out and save her by killing the wolf. Menzora, which is going to be the name of the wolf. And Ro's wolf runs off, and she stops Joram from shooting it with the bow. So she's kind of bonded with this wolf a little bit, or she keeps running into it. I don't know. The relationship will be very sporadic at this point. But so she's going to get attacked. Joram's going to save her. He's going to kill a wolf. And that's going to be not the inciting incident, but it kind of sets up for the next part of the inciting incident when we get there, which we won't talk about at this time. And then finally, they go back to the village, and Joram and Ro are now fighting because, of what happened in the forest with them. She doesn't want him to tell Guyan. He wants to tell Guyan. We'll get into all that. Maybe why later. I'm not going to get into all that now. Basically, it's going to be how you have to read the book, basically, to see how that all happens. But so the village holds their annual festival and retelling of the story of the High People, acted out in front of them. Artemis is determined that his people do not forget their history, and Rose says nothing about her confrontation with the wolves, but worries Joram will spill his guts at any moment. Slowly, lots of tension builds between Ro and Joram. He won't talk to her at all. She goes to her mother for help. Finally, Ro decides to tell Guyan, but before she can, the village is attacked. So that's going to lead right into an exciting incident. The conflict is going to obviously, she wants to serve her village well as per her fear of dishonoring her father. And so there's this kind of tension of she has her friend, but she, for reasons that I'm not going to explain at the moment, she's not going to want to tell. And then she needs to tell, there's just kind of a whole lot of stuff going on. And that's what makes it interesting. What makes you want to turn the page. So basically that's it for the opening hook of this story. I'm really excited about it. And I think it's coming along. I think it's progressing well into something that really is a solid page turner. I do feel like one of the things I'm going for with this book that you don't see in a lot of fantasy is fantasy tends to be very plot driven, which is why I think Harry Potter was such a big success, is because everyone could relate to those characters so well. And so some of the plot issues in those stories get overlooked again because you love the characters so much. So I'm trying to kind of write a story that's super complex, has a lot of plot moments, has a lot going on, but I really want to make sure that you feel these characters, even some of the characters from like Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time. The internal conflict part isn't so noticeable. You don't feel it as much. Even with Rand from Wheel of Time, basically he's just a kid in a small town who doesn't know any better. There's some of the internal conflict there is missing. And so while I will have lots of plot events and things will be plot driven at times, I really want to make sure that when you're watching these and reading these books, that you connect with the characters in a way that makes you want to keep turning the page. So thank you for watching this episode of Writing Quest. I'm so glad that you are here. Please subscribe, hit that like button, comment below if you have any questions. I'd love to talk to you, and we'll see you next time. Huzzah!